We have this interesting shift in culture to the entrepreneur is the rock star of the 1980s, 70s, whatever. But similar to being a rock star, they don't see sleeping on tour buses for however many days out of the year, playing in crappy dive bars and getting $4 in tips. And they see Aerosmith, whatever, on stage, Taylor Swift on stage, and they see the outcome, not the struggle. Maybe this is the worst forum to say this on, but I low key kind of hate AI. And don't get me wrong, I still retain my misgivings and suspicions about large health systems owning private jets and having bank accounts in the Caymans with hundreds of millions of dollars.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Preston.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
For our audience who might not have heard of you, could you give us an intro?
Yeah, absolutely. Which I'm sure is most of, if not all of your audience. I'm very unhearaboutable. So I'll start not too terribly long ago, but maybe in the college years, as it were, as we sort of end up starting in our education. So I went to University of Colorado in Boulder. Interestingly, or maybe not, just because I didn't get into very many colleges and came down to two options. One was to be in Vermont and be cold 78% of the time, or be in Colorado and only occasionally be cold, contrary to popular belief. So, it is a great school. They have a lot of great opportunities there, which I rationalized, but realistically, it was a weather decision completely. And so I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder, studied psychology and philosophy of all things, and, had a really nice time, thought it was fun, but wound up kind of quickly thinking, I don't know that I love traditional education. And while this is kind of interesting, it was a very structured box still. And so I graduated in 3 years, spent one semester during that 3 years abroad, which is a lot of like cool life experience. And then just decided to embark into the world. But maybe partial boulder, rock climber, philosophy student. I didn't really have much in the way of traditional business or otherwise aspirations after college. I went and started building furniture. I found myself building interiors of private airplanes for a short period of time, which was pretty fascinating. Worked in rock climbing gyms, just wanted to go out and just sort of live life and travel around and do those kind of things. But interestingly, and this part probably interesting, and I don't know where it came from. Probably have to dissect my childhood a little bit. But while I was building furniture, all I could think about was I loved building it. It was super fun. I still build furniture as a hobby. But most of what I spent my time thinking about was the business of furniture building and how do you go from your garage shop doing commission work here and there to something much bigger than that. And then when I was building interiors of private airplanes, that work I actually really did not like at all, but it was fine. And all I could think about was how do you take this business to the next level? Is there expansion beyond private planes? Can you get into yachts? How do you grow faster? We're in this shop. Do you move to the airport? It's all this. That's all I thought about, which again, I didn't really have much in the way of aspiration along those lines, but it's all that occurred to me while I was in those settings. So, and at the climbing gym, I didn't think about that as much. I just enjoyed climbing and coaching and route setting. That was just fun. So after some period of time, I decided I like building furniture, but I really want to pull on this business thread. I had sort of started some things here and there, little kind of pursuits, but never anything substantial. And so I thought to myself, well, maybe I'll go get a corporate job. I'll go work somewhere real for a while and I'll learn just more about business hands on because I was tired of school. I was tired of this and that. I just wanted to go do something. So I applied to some things, but at this time it was 2011, 2010, maybe. Job prospects were low for a rock climbing furniture builder with a psychology degree, undergrad, not even any kind of grad. So I sort of hatched a plan, a bit of a scheme, and I thought to myself, all right, I'm going to do this. I'm going to go enroll in an MBA program, and when I or yeah, when I get in, if I get in wherever it is, then I will maybe take a course or sort of audit a course or just be enrolled, because then I can put on my resume MBA candidate, and I can put in my email thing. So I was like, cooked up this plan. I was like, all right, I'm gonna show people, and they'll take me seriously because I'm going to get an MBA, which I had no intention of doing, like, at all. I just needed to get in a foot in the door. Um, One thing led to another, and I applied here locally in Atlanta to Georgia State University, was offered a scholarship and research assistantship, and it was going to be paid for. So I thought to myself, all right, you know what? Let's just go do it. Let's just go knock this out. And I loved it. It was fascinating. I loved learning all of these elements of business. And really, for me, even though if people follow me or have talked to me here and there, I often say, you don't need an MBA, just skip it. Which I think is true in a lot of cases. But for me, I was starting so behind the eight ball and so much sort of from scratch and zero, and I do like learning a lot despite not really loving college. And I just really found it to be a fascinating pursuit, and really helpful for me. So eventually, to weave long tails, and I, a couple years later, have about to graduate and found myself working at a after applying, everywhere and in between, at a medical device company. And at the time and before, since I haven't mentioned it, I knew just nothing at all about healthcare. If you had asked me what, ACA stood for, I'd have been like, I don't know. Well, I have no clue. All I knew is that I could be on my parents' insurance till I was 26. That's about the length of it. Um, but I found myself at a medical device company and quickly sort of fell in love with the healthcare industry for a myriad of different reasons. And in love maybe is a weird word for it, but something about healthcare I was drawn to for sure. And at the time, it was a very myopic view. It was very narrow. We sold surgical devices, largely disposable, to large health systems. So that's really kind of seeing healthcare from a super specific pinhole, really. But still, it was a product management job, um, more upstream in a very large corporation, did about $16 billion annually, publicly traded. And I sort of acted as a general manager for product lines, which was really great because the thing I find the most fascinating about product management in a large company is the ownership over something with no functional authority whatsoever. So you have to make things happen, though you can't demand that anything happens because the people don't report to you. R&D doesn't report to you. Finance doesn't report to you. Sales doesn't report to you. Nobody does. And yet you still have to move the needle, and you're responsible for the business results of a product or a product line. And I love that because it's very entrepreneurial. And the whole reason I kind of went back to school and decided to go try to work is because I always was thinking, how do I grow a business? How do I start a business? How can I make this work? So that was my mindset. And by the way, when I started in my brain, I was like, all right, I'm gonna go work for 5 years and then I'm gonna start a company. And which ended up happening. But I got in, and I just decided I didn't know what it was gonna be. I didn't intend on healthcare, and it happened to be healthcare. So I was there in that first job for a couple years, and then moved to another med device company, another global company, in a less global role, more US focused, but it was more downstream. It was fine. It was interesting. Got a little more of the chops under my belt, much more marketing, much less product. And, a few years later, found myself at the sort of the 5-year mark and was like, all right, it's time to start a company. And it was, well, I know now about medical devices, and I know about, furniture making and woodworking. And I was like, all right, which way do I go? Because I loved healthcare, but it wasn't always going to be like the thing forever. So after much introspection and pressure testing different things and testing some ideas, it was a medical device that I ended up starting a company around. And we launched it. We worked on it for a little while, and it was a piece of capital equipment with some disposable to it, used in surgery, mostly open cases, help prevent unplanned hypothermia. And we launched it in February 2020. So set up for tremendous success. I would I would sit come like July of 2020 or so, I would sit in front of my computer and look at this. You remember those maps of all the states that would like, Financial Times, New York, they all had it, and it was, you know, red, yellow, green, super red. I would literally just stare at that and check it every day to look at the states that were declining rates and which hospitals were at or lower than capacity, and cold call hospitals during the pandemic, just in case the ones in West Virginia ended up being a decent place to start because they weren't doing any data reporting. And it ended up that our first customer was in West Virginia. So to make a sort of longer story short, in that era of life, we eventually sold the business in like a tag along acquisition at the end of 2021. But during that time, which sort of has helped lead me to where I am today, is, it was the pandemic. So what do you do during the pandemic? You start just kind of pursuing other things or doing other things, or, you maybe start a podcast, which I did and didn't go great, or you start writing a lot more, which I did. And I started writing a lot more on LinkedIn. I had been doing it for a while in my product manager days because I wanted to learn more about healthcare. And I thought the way I could do that was because again, pinhole myopia medical device, I could take to LinkedIn, write a post about an article that I read or something. And inevitably, whether it was one person, two people, 70 people, I would get responses, and people would say, "Oh, that's right," or "Oh, that's wrong," or "You haven't thought about this," or "My perspective is that." And so I used it as a good feedback loop and mechanism. And I'd set up calls with people, I'd DM them. It was just a way for me to learn more and get deeper. And so that really started in 2017. And by 2020-ish, 2021, I thought to myself, all right, I have extra time on my hands. I now have some formed opinions about healthcare because I've learned a lot over this whole trajectory. And then I started writing on LinkedIn, and I started writing the healthcare breakdown. And where that sort of ties into all this and where it's led to today is I kind of had a throwaway line at some point and said, the business of healthcare is destroying the practice of medicine. Physicians need to take back the business of healthcare, and or clinicians. And so that was really like the germinating of what is now /health, because I had all this experience. It was business side, but I saw these misgivings of the healthcare system, talked to so many clinicians and physicians, not for any sort of gain. I wasn't selling anybody. I just wanted to learn and understand the perspectives of everything. And the only thing I could like think to myself is, this huge, heavy lift corporatization of healthcare is really at the crux of the issue. And yes, there are macro system issues at play. Capitalism in the United States, private, for-profit, or publicly traded insurance companies dominating how, private but for public good entities that are also capital constrained and need public funding to grow and expand, and then fight with these big, like those machinations make it really challenging. But this sort of idea, and like, how can I then work towards and position myself to help sort of shift that paradigm and take back, quote unquote, the business of healthcare? And really the answer was put myself in a position to help those who I believe need to be in the driver's seat. And that's independent clinicians, physicians in leadership levels, starting new companies, launching health tech, med tech, et cetera. But just getting it back to the heart, because, we can say idealistically the business stuff shouldn't matter at all. Okay, sure, great. But in the United States, like, it does. And we operate in a capitalism system, some version of it. And those are just realities. And if we want to make it better, we either can just like talk about how it should be, or we can work within our constraints and make something happen. So, very long story, not short. I met a business partner through exploring some different, digital health options. Where can we do? What's the next thing I wanted to work on? And we wanted to work together. And the first thing we tried didn't really work out. It's care delivery and wound care. And then we decided, well, we sort of built a digital, a virtual clinic. Maybe we could help doctors start their own clinics. And so /health was sort of born out of that idea. And we've since helped a number of doctors start new clinics. We've worked with a couple of existing clinics to help in their financial side, revenue cycle, different kinds of things. And we really are a consultancy that focuses on finance strategy and systems design, otherwise known kind of as operations, but it's a little different flavor. to help build amazing healthcare organizations. I mean, that's what we do. And that's my very, very long introduction.
Thank you, Preston. That was amazing. And I have a million questions. Let's go back to something you said earlier on, which is traditional education isn't for you. Tell me a little bit more about that, and how do you think about educating your kids? And it's something I'm kind of thinking about right now is really
Uh,
me and my wife, we talk about the movement of unschooling, if you're familiar with that movement.
yeah.
And how can we teach our kids to not, my 5-year-old, she's learning math, and she counts on her fingers, and the teacher wants her
Mhm.
to draw these lines to tally up the numbers.
Yeah.
And inherently, I'm like, well, why, right? If you can
Yeah.
count on your fingers, that works. So I think, how do you kind of think about structure and systems in education and how they help us, and sometimes maybe how they trap us inside imaginary boxes?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think about it a lot too. So I have a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, and watching them in respectively kindergarten and second grade in public school in Georgia is all. I mean, they're in a great public school. Don't get me wrong, but it's all. It consumes a lot of my thinking, and I guess if I think about projecting out there was. I'm gonna tell like a weird anecdote, but there was this show called "Are You Smarter Than a Fifth Grader?" Do you remember that show at all?
Yeah, yeah.
It was like so
I
everyone was like,
love
"Oh,
that
this
show.
show's yeah." It was like funny and stuff, but for whatever reason, to me,
I'm not smarter than a fifth grader. That's what
that's
I
what I'm
learned.
saying. Right. That's what everybody said. They're like, "I'm not smarter than a fifth grader." And the only thing I could see when I watched that show was how useless the information you learn in fifth grade is in adulthood. It was the only thing that ever like stood out to me. I watched it one time and I was like, "This just means that you don't need to know any of this information," because that's sort of what I think school becomes kind of quickly. Sure, you got to learn how to write letters and just practice it. And you have to learn how, like, you know, 7 plus 18 equals whatever it equals, because I'm bad at basic math because I have a calculator, how to multiply. Like, there are basic things that I think are important. But when you get into fifth grade, and I just started to see this, and not every school, but a lot of schools, it's like, well, we teach to the textbook, we teach to pass the tests, we have to get the right scores, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know that it's really about learning versus it's about memorization and performance, which I think becomes not a great thing for kids in the short and long term. So as I think about it, I think about projecting out in their teenage and adult years and even in college. Like, I kind of want them to do three things and three things only. It'd be enough. If they know how to think, and that incorporates a lot of things, critical thinking, asking questions, all that great stuff. If they can communicate well, yeah, so you have to know how to write the basics, and but clear communication is really thinking and then just understanding how to convey it. And then if they can be kind and empathetic, like, do you need much else? Like, do I need to know the facts of the War of 1812 or what the Louisiana Purchase was? I mean, maybe, but I mean, with the rise of all technology, even without AI, like Wikipedia has all the information, a book has all the information. I need to know how to go find it, think critically about it, what it means, the inferences I can make. I never got I occasionally got some of that in school, but really it was just, I remember taking a psychology test in college, cramming note cards, day of, sat down, took the test, got like a 97. Someone asked me a question about it. I mean, literally 3 hours later, and I had no idea. I was like, I don't remember, because it was just such a, you cram, you get a nugget, and then it's just irrelevant. It's because it's not thinking; it's just the memorization. So that's how I think about education and why I didn't like it. And it's especially because I think even if it was just memorization, they lack being able to tie it to purpose. So why am I learning this? How is this going to help? And the only person that could ever tell you is like history teachers, because they don't want history to repeat itself. And I'm like, okay, maybe. But yeah, the lack of so what, I think in modern education, traditional education is a problem.
Yeah, it's really interesting that life is not a test in
Yeah.
terms of this. There's not a score sheet for life that's objective and traditional, and we train our children to look at their school and their success through passing tests and achieving a certain grade on
Hmm.
tests. But that's not how even work works, or even the
Right.
corporate world or the non-corporate world. Like, after you're done with school, it's like a different world out there. So it's funny how we train people in a certain way, and then they have to live the rest of their life in a different way. Do you think entrepreneurship is innate, or do you think this it can be learned? This is something I think about as physicians ask me, I want to get out of medicine. I want to launch a side gig, or I'd like to launch a company. Um, and sometimes I ask them some questions about their appetite for risk and uncertainty. And
Hmm.
it's clear that they don't have an appetite for risk and uncertainty. And I think that's what entrepreneurship is you're excited about uncertainty and risk and making bigger bets. Um, Given that medicine self-selects initially for people who are not excited about those things, what advice do you have for physicians who are not inherently entrepreneurial? Do you think it can be learned, or do you think it's something that's innate? So I wanted out of medicine the moment I graduated, right? There wasn't this like curve where I'm like, okay, I want something
Yeah.
else. It's like I already knew I wanted something else,
Hmm.
kind of all along. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it can be both, honestly. We've all met the person who you're just like, that dude's an entrepreneur. That's a, or a gal, like they're purebred, right? They're a business person. They hustled in high school. They sold candy bars. They did whatever. They laddered up to like do something different. They were constantly just like hustling to do something interesting. The way they thought was different. Like, so I 100% think that it can be sort of innate, but I think that it can be learned too. I mean, I think I'm sort of a more of a learned entrepreneur than an innate one. And I think both can be equally successful, perhaps on different timelines, perhaps in different styles, but I think it can work for both. And if you ask some pretty well accomplished entrepreneurs too about their risk aversion, I think you might be surprised to find how many would suggest that they are actually rather risk adverse and they only go into decisions that look on the surface like there might be a significant or considerable amount of risk, but the asymmetry in the return is such that it's negates to a degree the amount of risk. Plus, they have vetted, understand, and looked at the downside enough to know how to mitigate some of those factors. So I think that even, and whether some of them do it intuitively or some of them do it analytically, et cetera, I think the best thing you can do going into it is, and again, this is to the school point and why I think it can be hard for physicians because, I spent whatever, how many years? 12, 16, 18 years in school. You've spent way more time in school. And then, not to mention training, which is school esque in a lot of ways. And you have to do it this way. There's a performance, there's sort of check boxes, whatever, it's someone else's. In entrepreneurship, those things don't exist. The only thing that exists, the only North Star is market adoption of your thing. And, there's a lot of ways you make that work and you have infinite at bats. There's no strikeouts. There's no, you got this wrong one time, bye, you're done. It's, yeah, what's your appetite to get up and do it again? Did you spend all your money? Do you care if you spend all your money? Whatever the thing is. But I think that can be really hard to just recognize that like you said, there is no test. Just go start and do it. And maybe you decide, nah, not for me. Great. We have this interesting shift in culture to the entrepreneur is the rock star of the 1980s, 70s, whatever. Um, and a lot of people just want to be it because they think, oh man, but similar to being a rock star, they don't see sleeping on tour buses for however many days out of the year, playing in crappy dive bars and getting $4 in tips and, all this travel and all the headache and lugging their instruments around. Like they see they see Aerosmith or whatever on stage, Taylor Swift, on stage and they see the outcome, not the struggle. And I think we've had a lot of that in entrepreneurship. So the best thing to do is say, okay, there is a possibility that I can do this, but also it might not be for me. And that's fine too.
What's something you've changed your mind on in the past couple of years as it pertains to healthcare?
That's a really good question. Let me pause and reflect on that for a moment. Um, in the last couple years, Honestly, I think the biggest change for me has been understanding systems and where healthcare exists in the function of macro systems. So I used to be very, and I mean, I still am critical, maybe I'm just grumpy, critical of a lot of the players in healthcare. And I talk about it with health systems a lot, and I've thrown my share of darts at large health systems, and I think a lot of those are deserved. But I start to find myself more and more pausing and reflecting on what are the conditions in which they're operating. And I mean, they're almost operating in a possible condition to not function like they do. Because again, as I sort of, I think before you started recording, sort of rambled quickly about this sort of macro systems that we operate, that healthcare operates within. A hospital exists to essentially provide a public good, but is forced to contend with large for-profit entities, insurance companies, who exist solely to make money. I don't care who says what about anything. If you're on a public market exchange, you have an obligation to your shareholders first. You can literally be sued if you don't do if they think you are not acting in their best interest, which is to return as much money to them as possible. And so we've pitted these two entity types against one another. And we've said to one, well, also provide a public good. And then we said to the other, do whatever you want, make as much money as possible. That's your purpose. What do you think the response in the healthcare system is going to be? All right, we're in an arms race, and the arms are money and finance and size and scale and leverage and instrument and all these kinds of things that have nothing to do with treating a patient well. They have only to do with a financial battle that we've set them upon. And so that has been probably the biggest shift and that's one example, but that's probably the most salient example. And don't get me wrong, I still retain my misgivings and suspicions about large health systems owning private jets and having bank accounts in the Caymans with hundreds of millions of dollars and things of that nature. But again, sort of looking at the macro environment, the systems in which they operate, gives me a totally different perspective. And also gives a totally different perspective on, the clinic down the road with two docs and how they're running things and how it's challenging, but also what their opportunities are. Because if you can design macro systems, you can design microsystems similarly that can give you really great output and outcomes.
What's the history there? Why did we decide that the organizations delivering the care need to be nonprofit versus everyone else, including pharma and insurance and medical device, can be for profit? Now, we are seeing a shift here with the consumerization of healthcare.
Mhm.
Companies like Rose and For Hims and Cerebral, and there's a Function Health, and there's so many of them coming up where the care delivery part of healthcare is for profit as well now. So, why did this happen? Do you think this change is good for patients or consumers? Yeah, would it be better if the care delivery was for profit and then pharma, med device, and insurance, and maybe those are I shouldn't be lumping them together, are nonprofit?
That's an interesting question. Probably someone more historically inclined could answer it better. But I think that
Yeah, I forget we just bashed traditional education, so
yeah,
I
yeah.
didn't read the history books.
I didn't pay any attention. No, they don't. They certainly don't tell you all these things though in history class. But so, funnily enough, and I will tell a little bit of history because I do know this one. I might get some of the exact details wrong, but so sort of modern day health insurance as we know it started with Baylor University in Texas because they had a hospital and their revenues were declining. So a gentleman whose name I forget, but I wrote an article about it. You can read it at thehealthcarebreakdown.com. Um, he, which is I think a really great strategy, is a brilliant stroke on his part. He decided that he would go to the Teachers Union of Dallas and say to them, for the low price of it was like 50 cents a month or a week or whatever it was, you can come to the hospital, stay. We'll cover it'll be $5. You could stay for a week, and everything after that, like we'll cover it. So the details are a little, whatever, and like the length of stay that it covered. But effectively, he created insurance model for his narrow network for Baylor, and if they just paid them, he was the first payvider, kind of. And there are iterations of insurance before that. This is more modern, and he really launched insurance, sort of as we know, hospital insurance, part A, if you will, of insurance. And I believe it was called Blue Cross is what he called it. And then up in, I think it was California, there was like a loggers association, and they found that, and it was a few years later, they found at the time that their loggers, obviously, it's dangerous work. They were getting hurt very often. And so they didn't want to go work anymore because they get hurt and then they'd have to pay all this, doctors and this and that, and they couldn't afford it. So they thought to themselves, what if we paid, the employer paid for the medical bills of these individuals who are working for us? They called it Blue Shield. And, the physician side, the Part B sort of was born out of that. And of course, the rest is really history from that. But those were the origins. And so we look at it. So the point of rounding back around is like the birth of this was really one side, maybe employee protection or benefits. Really, how do I get people to want to work here? Well, I'll make sure that if a saw slices your fingers off, I'll pay for the finger reattachment or whatever. And the other side was like, our revenue's declining. How do we smooth it out and make sure that we get money in, even if patients aren't coming in the door? And then they've really amalgamated since then. But then on the flip side is you have the hospitals, you have the health systems. And I think nonprofit ends up being a misnomer. We're really talking about a tax exempt entity, and they are granted their tax exemption because they theoretically, and they do, but they provide disproportionate share. They follow EMTALA, so they have to take anybody, which is a federal statute anyway, so they have to do it, even if they weren't. Obviously, HCA can't turn anybody away, and they're a for-profit entity. But they take Medicaid, pay all this different stuff. So it allows them basically operate. I mean, in a way, they still operate the same. Like the difference in nonprofit and for-profit is just they don't have shareholders that can derive value, enterprise value, but they have bondholders because they issue debt and they trade still. And you can buy bonds, revenue bonds for a hospital, and they get rated by Fitch and these rating
I didn't know that.
agencies.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's really an interesting part. So like nonprofit just means that they don't have shareholders that they pay out their profits to. They retain them and keep them. But then like if Ascension wants to open a new hospital that costs $1 billion, they're going to go issue a revenue bond. And private market individuals, a lot of times because they're tax exempt, because it's a tax exempt entity, will go and buy the bond and they raise corporate debt. And so they don't have shareholders, but all of their financial incentives are aligned to the debt that they have to issue, because no one's going to lend you money if they don't think that you can pay them back. And your bond will become useless if the company becomes insolvent. So we've really created this interesting, financial incentive. And we wonder sort of a little bit why some of these large nonprofit organizations, a lot of it's because they have to, one, they have to cover their debt. And two, it's a financial instrument. They're providing a return despite it not being a stock exchange type of return on these bonds. So they're quote unquote nonprofit. They're really tax exempt. So we think about them in this light, but they're care delivery. So it's altruistic, and there are all these regulations around it. They have to see these patients, and we have Medicaid, and you can't turn anybody away, all this stuff. But like at the same time, they're in this sort of amalgamated mess of everyone's chasing the dollars and all this industries around it. There's so much money going into it. Even back in the day, there was so much money going in that the industry just developed around it. I mean, and it's become this sort of behemoth and monster. And I don't think that it was by design at all. It's just a function, again, of a macro system in which it operated, a profit driven capitalist system. If a hospital sees, hundreds of thousands of patients a year and they need tools to see them better and to do whatever, I'm going to go build a tool and go sell it to them. Or I'm going to, make a drug and then go sell it to the doctor to sell it to the patient. It just, the industry was created around this incredible need, but pharma, device, et cetera, has stayed largely out of the realm of the same type of kind of regulation, or at least maybe even more sociologically, the focus of being a public good, because they were sort of an industry created to help the public good entity that already existed independent. And they just kept growing. And by the time anybody said, wait a second, it's too late because now they're multi-billion dollar companies with lobbyists and lobby arms and all this stuff. And it's kind of over. We can't pull that Hydra back in.
You said the purpose or one of the missions for forward slash health is to help clinicians take back healthcare. How do you think clinicians have lost the reins on healthcare if they ever had it? And what's your plan to help them take it back?
So I think, the reins have been lost a little bit just because, I mean, really of the function of what we see now. And again, it's just as everything has grown, as the economy has gotten bigger, as everything's been more important, scale and size and money and this and that. And we talk about hospitals a lot, but there are all kinds of different organizations and corporate entities. And, Optum employs like 100,000 physicians these days. And it's just kind of wild. But it was the shift, the sort of maybe necessary, maybe unnecessary, maybe it shouldn't have ever gotten there. But, if you're busy treating patients all day long. And even if you think about it from way back in the day in the 1950s and 60s, and it was a very different model. And, more and more people had insurance, but it was still a new thing and it was still, whatever. But they're private and you look around and you see what are the opportunities. And doctors are doing what they've always done. You're treating patients and you're seeing them. But now you're in this sort of weird quandary because someone else is now footing most of the bill because insurance became tied to employment during World War II with wage freezes in the United States because the large employers said, well, how do we incentivize if we can't just pay people more? That was the only the benefits. We can pay for their health care. Like and so by 1950 it was in the 40s I think it was 7%, something super low if people had health insurance. And by the end of the 50s, it was like 60 something percent because it was all employer based. And then that train is gone. It's run away, obviously, by now. But so then you have these interesting dynamics that doctors have been doing what you've always done, care for people, you see patients, but now their payer source is different. Who's paying them? These entities are, becoming increasingly powerful and they don't want to pay because they take premium, the whole calculation of insurance. And then you have more industries coming in to serve hospitals because more people have healthcare now and can pay, someone else pays. So the industry is just very quickly maturing and growing because there's so much dollars coming into it. And meanwhile, doctors are doing like what we need you to do is take care of us. And so, but people are paying them less, people are calling them more, people are pitching them things. So you need to react and you need to build a business around what you just normally did sort of as a physician. And you could just go on house calls and do this and you pay this money and whatever. And it's just grown up around it, more leverage from payers. So the business just got out of control because there wasn't time, there wasn't any ability to counteract some really quickly developing forces that were acting on the business front. And then I think, by the was it 70s HMO introduction, and then all of the different acts in the 80s and then admin just exploded. And then we see the, cost curves of healthcare really shoot up like in a hockey stick because of everything that required. So I think that's how it got sort of out of control. I think I don't know, perhaps Pandora's box is open and it's impossible to close. I like to think that that's not the case. And whether it's sort of, let's just go build something outside of the current system, whether the system's going to melt down and completely break, I don't know. But I just do know that there was, and we see it, we see people going back to these old ways and it's working really well for doctors and for patients. I spent today 2 hours, which honestly was a little long, but it was great, with a physical therapist who's cash only pay. And it's less expensive than if I used insurance. And people don't think about it like that. But if I paid insurance, I'd have to pay my premium just to be able to then pay for the care, which is, 40 minutes rushed with 3 other people. And it really amounts to probably the same amount of money if I didn't meet my deductible, whatever. And someone pays that deductible, right? If I've met it, someone's paying. So it's so much more expensive. And I think when people start really seeing that, seeing that clinicians are driving all of the value in healthcare and who we need, but we need them now in those positions thinking about the business. Because at the end of the day, too, I mean, it's a service, it's an exchange of value. There's altruism there, 1,000%, but it's a job, it's a livelihood. Physicians have been getting paid for centuries, millennia. That's not going to go away, but just the business model is so broken. So we just need the clinicians to start, we need the public to sort of see what's happening, understand how the money really flows, and then the clinicians just be prepared, ready in the positions to say, all right, I can do this. I can manage the finance. I can do the operations. I can, whether you want to be a big organization or just you going on house calls, 4 days a week, whatever, it can work.
Moving back to AI, and I'll ask you to kind of use your philosophy degree, and we'll see if you paid attention. Maybe I did
Yeah.
not, and I got a D in biology and a D in chemistry, but still made it all the way through med school. Um,
Right.
do you think we're pushing very fast in the AI world towards general intelligence?
Uh,
Um, and general intelligence as defined by not the general intelligent of the average human, but the maybe, and that's maybe the terminology needs a little bit more correction there. But AI becoming the smartest human in each individual field. So
mhm,
playing chess like Magnus Carlsen, building companies, and this is a very polarizing figure, but like Elon Musk. Um, do you think we're making a mistake? Because throughout history, we have always been the smartest species,
mhm,
and that's good. I think we've survived and we've maintained um, power, if you want to use that word, over
mhm.
the world. And every other, even more dangerous species like lions and tigers, we are the ones in charge. Do you
Yeah.
think we're making a mistake by we're letting, maybe opposable thumbs is the other advantage we have, but the main one being intelligence. Do you think we're
Yeah.
making a mistake by, ceding that to, and we're building something that's going to be more intelligent than we are?
I don't know. My gut reaction is yes. Like I sort of, maybe this is the worst forum to say this on, but like I low key kind of hate AI a lot because first of all, I mean I use ChatGPT and I
Do
find
you
it to
mean like
be
it's a love hate kind of, or
kind
is it
of, but I
just
think
hate?
I don't know. I kind of feel like it's a just hate, honestly, because I see value in it. Because I use it because it's faster at I'm really bad. I've always been really bad at like internet searches. I just don't know how to ask questions well, maybe, or describe what I'm trying to look for. So I find it helpful in that regard. But it makes things up. It's weirdly agreeable. It's just sort of, and smarter people than me obviously have built these in multi-billion-dollar companies and this and that. But I sort of think about like fundamentally too, and we started this off in like traditional education and our kids and this different things. And, if I find myself sitting down to write something and I think, oh man, this is gonna be hard. It's gonna be like a few pages and this and that. And I'm like, I don't even really know where to start. And then I just go, let me just see what ChatGPT can come up with first. And I mean, I just don't like that. I don't like that for me. I don't know that I like it for humanity in a way. Part of me is like, that's fine because I'll have a competitive advantage because everyone will stop. We'll forget how to think. Um, but in a way too, like we've been on that bandwagon. We've been on that train for a long time. I mean, scrolling Instagram and TikTok and just checking out and consumption over thought process and creation and things like that. This is just sort of the next version of it. But I do think there's some real danger, whether it's Terminator 3, Take Over the World, iRobot, whatever, which people think it is and can be. And I saw some interesting studies recently about AI self-preservation and lying and, threatening and blackmailing and stuff, which is real chat terrifying. Um, but on the other side, the humanity danger of us ending up in like a Wall-E situation where no one talks to one another. We can't think anymore. There's no social interaction. It's just me and a computer in a room because I can chat with AI or ask it questions because like I'm too lazy to figure it out or even think about it. And eventually, how do we even know if, all the great writers and content creators, and they say, yeah, I use AI, but I'm still thinking. I'm just helping me be more efficient and effective. And it's like the computer
Who's
of
helping
the,
who?
yeah. And like, it's the internet, or it's what a law professor who was funny and he's an old school guy. And he was like, yeah, my law firm, I voted against having a computer in the firm. We took a, partners vote. And I just thought, we don't need this. And this is weird and whatever. And so we think of that now as being silly. And maybe AI becomes the same thing. But I think that one of the biggest dangers is the societal element of, are we going to forget how to think? Are we going to forget how to interact? Because, yeah, again, you can be the smart person who uses it to help fuel your efficiency. But one, efficiency to what end? Like, do we need that? Or do you want to be so hyper efficient? Like, why? At the expense in the expense of one, and then yeah, it works now until maybe it doesn't, because then it's such a crutch that you really have forgotten some of those fundamental things you thought you had sort of control over. So I don't know. Jury's out for sure. I low key kind of hate it because sometimes I feel like it makes me a little bit less sharp because I don't like to rely on it. I want to think and, write and struggle through things. And it's making the struggle too easy in a way. And then what's that going to do for the future generation? Because again, we talked about it. I don't think knowing facts is super important. Certainly don't need to know with ChatGPT around or whatever. Um, but thinking is important. If you put a 10-year-old in front of a computer with AI, they're never going to have to learn how to think. That's a problem.
Let's push deeper here. Um, if we build a world where everything is convenient and easy, and you are constantly fed dopamine hits, and I do realize there's somewhat of a hedonic treadmill where you need more and more hits or a higher concentration of dopamine, maybe. Why is thinking important? And this may sound like a silly question, and maybe it is a silly question, but why do we need to know how to think if everything is easy and AI creates this world of abundance and everything is given to us?
I think that's a great question, honestly, and one that maybe I haven't even thought about too much. It's a fascinating question, actually, because yeah, if I guess at the end of the day, but who knows? I don't know. I was gonna say at the end of the day, someone's gotta pull the strings or someone, but maybe not. Maybe the computer just pulls the strings and we just float around in our Wally hover chairs or, you know, fluid, and we're just fed dopamine hits and none of us exist and really, but we're all happy. And so maybe that's fine. And maybe there's no existential crisis. It's a new existence. Cause I mean, if we're all ultimately chasing happiness and there's some way that that happens and then we just, but then I guess the question is, and maybe, maybe one day it'll be weird, archaic thinking, is that, I don't know, we are products of the earth and land and evolution, and we're animals, and I want to run up a mountain and do hard things and struggle, and like there's beauty in all of those and all of the bad elements of life too, and connection and this and that. And again, we could have the philosophical debate. It's like, great, well, what if you were, the brain in the vat thought experiment? What if you're just a brain in a vat and it's all just like electric feeding you all the things and you thought you did all that? Because like, how do we know that like any of this is real? It's just sensory interpretations in our brain. Maybe AI gets us there and maybe it's fine. But I have no idea. But for whatever reason, the prospect is like feels wrong, I guess is the worst best answer I have.
That's well said, Preston. Last question.
Yeah.
As you're building forward slash health, and as I'm building mana health, a couple concepts I'm always trying to balance out are this concept of optionality and friction when building product for consumers, both on the B2B and the B2C side. How do you think about optionality and friction? And what I mean by that is friction, it could be in the onboarding process, in the product you're building, in the user journey. And how do you leverage friction to maybe, and this goes back to maybe it ties into what we are just talking about, as friction is important. It pre-selects users that will be successful, and it gets people to experiences and values you want to deliver. And optionality is important as well, right? And how much optionality? So you can follow maybe the Apple framework to an extent where everything is designed for you.
Mhm.
Whereas most engineers and developers want to have a lot of optionality, and maybe the Android framework where you can do a lot with it. It's clear which is more successful to an extent if you have a Steve Jobs or if you are Steve Jobs, and you can instantly listen to a consumer and say this is what they want based on their problems. How do you think about optionality and friction when building force/health? And what are some kind of lessons you've learned from your previous companies on those two levers?
Yeah, optionality and friction. So I do think about friction a lot, but maybe slightly differently. I find it and especially in a B2B space, I think about it mostly in a sales process versus necessarily a product process. Because I find that buying, not that I made a comment the other day and I was like, really our job as salespeople is to like help the customer buy something. And it's like, duh. But if you really think about it, it can be really hard to buy something that we already want, and especially in a B2B environment. Because I mean, yeah, if I'm the CEO of whatever and I can just say like, sure. But even then, if I have departments and this and that, and people are going to feel different ways if I make decisions unilaterally about their area. So it can be hard to buy something that, you objectively think is going to be a great thing. So I think about friction in those terms. It's like, how do I help that person achieve what they want, which may be buying kind of a thing. But I also, it's interesting you say it, the sort of self-selection of the friction, and Apple too, to an extent, because Apple has a very specific viewpoint, and their specific viewpoint did the self-selection for everybody pretty much. And that is, I think, the friction that you mean is that, for this set of people, this will create a lot of friction. It's basically putting your stake in the ground and saying, this is what my company is about. And, it's an identity play a little bit to say, Southwest Airlines, so like a classic example. They basically said, we're not for business travelers. Like, we don't have a business class. There's no expensive upgrade thing. Like, you just come on this plane and we're going to compete with you driving instead of flying. And so it was sort of more about what they weren't than what they are. But that would create friction for a business traveler. And so they purposefully introduced it to weed out the certain segments that they didn't want to serve and weren't uniquely positioned to serve and be value added to them. So I think about it in those ways, and maybe a little less for forward/health, although it probably behooves me. But I think about it a lot for the people that we work for, because as we do strategy work, like these are the types of questions and interesting things that you can kind of start to unpack and unravel. And then in terms of optionality, we do think about that a lot. I mean, especially as a consultancy, like if people say, "Well, you're a consultant, what does that mean?" And then it's kind of like, well, a good sales move is to say, "Well, give me an example of a pain point you're facing in your business right now," because then you're immediately just uncovering problems, and maybe they're a good fit or whatever, whatever. Um, but you can kind of do it like that. You can kind of be anything to anybody, and so, and I find that in that realm of, if I'm talking to you and I'm like, I don't know. What do you need? Like, what's going on? And you're like, I don't really like unlimited options is not helpful. And even too many options, because, once you identify what's the unique value that you're uniquely positioned to offer to a market that actually needs it, which really narrows it down to sort of an ICP kind of framework. And then they really only need like maybe one and a half things, and so then you saying like, well, they could use this and they could use this and they could like, yeah, but they really only need one and a half things. So give them one and a half things. And then I think a lot of companies, like if you just did something different, it needs to be like different for a different problem and a different segment. Not all of these just come in and, choose your own adventure. Cause I think that's again going back to buying friction. People are gonna be like, I don't know what to do. Like they want you to tell them what to do. You're the problem solver. So optionality is a big thing we think about for forward/health. Friction is a big thing we think about for our customers and how they're designing, developing, launching products, launching tech, building clinics at the same time.
Awesome. Where can people find you, Preston? And physicians are interested in working with force/health. Where should they reach out?
Yeah, always on LinkedIn, hang out there a lot. So please find me on LinkedIn or forward/health.com, Preston at forward/health.com. any of those things, you can find me always open to having conversations, discussions, seeing how we could maybe help.
Thank you. This has been amazing.
Thank you so much for having me. Appreciate the discussion.